Emily Carter never imagined that running from a broken heart would lead her straight into the arms of danger. After a devastating divorce in New York, she did the only thing that made sense, bought a one-way ticket to Tuscany, an isolated villa, endless vineyards, peace. That's all she wanted. But when her mysterious neighbor appeared at her door with a dangerous smile and eyes that held secrets, Emily realized she'd traded the pain of her past for something far more risky. Federico Santini wasn't just a charming millionaire. He was connected to the Mafia, and she, unknowingly, had just entered the most dangerous game of her life. If you love forbidden romance, suspense and second chances, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's begin. The rain hammered against the taxi window as Emily watched Manhattan disappear in the rearview mirror. The city lights, which once seemed to glow with promise, now felt like cruel reminders of everything she'd lost. Her phone buzzed. Again. David, her ex-husband. She didn't even glance at the screen. What was there left to say? That their 5-year marriage had crumbled because he chose someone else? That the woman he'd been seeing for months was now living in the apartment they'd renovated together? That Emily had spent 6 weeks sleeping on her best friend's couch because she couldn't bear to be in their home? Emily's chest tightened. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, grounding herself in the moment. The numbness she'd felt for weeks was starting to crack, and beneath it something raw and desperate clawed to get out. She could still see David's face when she'd confronted him. The guilt, the relief that he'd been caught. Like some part of him had wanted her to find out all along. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he'd said, as if that made it better, as if 5 years of marriage could be erased by an apology. Emily blinked hard, forcing the memory away. She'd spent too many nights replaying that conversation, dissecting every word, every lie. She was done. "JFK, right?" the driver asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice sounded foreign, hollow, like it belonged to someone else. The airport loomed ahead, its lights cutting through the storm like beacons. Emily clutched her passport tighter, feeling the worn edges press into her skin. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a faded photograph of her grandmother standing in front of a stone villa in Tuscany, arms wide, face radiant with a smile that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. Her grandmother used to say, "When life breaks you, Bella, you go where the earth remembers how to heal." Emily was going to Tuscany. She was going to disappear. The airport was chaos. People rushing, announcements echoing, children crying. Emily moved through it all like a ghost, her single suitcase trailing behind her. At the gate, she sat in the corner, away from the crowds. She pulled out her phone one last time. 23 missed calls from David, 14 text messages, 3 voicemails. Emily deleted them all without reading or listening. Then she turned off her phone completely. The finality of the gesture made her hands shake. A woman sitting nearby glanced at her with concern. "You okay, honey?" Emily forced a smile. "Just nervous about flying." The lie came easily. The woman patted her hand. "You'll be fine, just breathe." If only it were that simple. When they called her boarding group, Emily stood on trembling legs. She walked down the jet bridge, each step feeling heavier than the last. But when she settled into her seat and the plane began to taxi, something unexpected happened. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. She was leaving. She was actually leaving. The flight was long, endless. Emily barely slept, her mind replaying fragments of her old life like a film she couldn't turn off. The wedding, David's hands shaking as he slid the ring onto her finger. The apartment, paint samples spread across the floor, his arm around her waist. The lies, late nights at work, mysterious phone calls, the perfume that wasn't hers on his collar. "Stop," she told herself, "stop." But her mind wouldn't listen. She ordered a glass of wine, then another. The alcohol dulled the sharp edges of her thoughts, but it couldn't erase them completely. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Emily finally drifted into a restless sleep. She dreamed of her grandmother, of sun-drenched hills and stone houses, of a life that felt simple and whole. When the plane finally touched down in Florence, Emily woke with a start. Through the window, she could see the Italian countryside bathed in golden morning light. Her breath caught. It was beautiful. She rented a car at the airport, her hands still shaking slightly as she signed the paperwork. The rental agent gave her directions in broken English, gesturing animatedly with his hands. "You go Chianti region, yes?" Beautiful. Very beautiful. You will love. Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. She loaded her suitcase into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. The steering wheel felt strange in her hands. Foreign, unfamiliar. For a moment, panic gripped her chest. What was she doing? She didn't speak Italian. She didn't know anyone here. She'd rented a villa based on photographs online and a review from someone named Travel Lover 22. This was insane. But then, she thought of David, of the apartment, of New York and its suffocating memories, and she turned the key. The drive through the Tuscan countryside was like entering another world. Winding roads lined with cypress trees, rolling hills covered in vineyards. Medieval villages perched on hilltops, their stone buildings glowing amber in the afternoon sun. Emily rolled down the window, letting the warm air wash over her face. It smelled different here, earthy, clean, like something ancient and enduring. Her GPS guided her through narrow streets and past fields of sunflowers until finally she turned onto a gravel road that climbed steadily upward. And then she saw it. The villa sat perched on a hill, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards that stretched endlessly into the horizon. It was small but charming, with terracotta tiles, weathered shutters, and ivy climbing the stone walls like it had been there for centuries. Emily parked the car and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no sirens, no voices. Just the wind rustling through the olive trees and the distant sound of birds. Emily walked to the edge of the property and looked out at the view. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The hills rolled on forever, dotted with farmhouses and vineyards. For the first time in months, Emily felt her shoulders drop. The tightness in her chest loosened just a little. She unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The villa smelled of lavender and old stone. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. It was perfect. Emily set her suitcase down and walked through the small rooms, a living area with exposed beams and a fireplace, a kitchen with terracotta tiles and copper pots hanging on the walls, a bedroom with a wrought iron bed and white linens that looked impossibly soft, and everywhere windows that framed the Tuscan countryside like living paintings. Emily walked out onto the terrace and sank into one of the weathered chairs. She pulled her knees to her chest and just sat there, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The tears came unexpectedly, not the violent, choking sobs she'd cried in New York, but quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks and dripped onto her jeans. She cried for the marriage that had failed, for the life she'd planned that would never happen, for the version of herself she'd lost somewhere along the way. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but there nonetheless. This is where I start over, Emily thought, and for the first time she believed it might actually be possible. The first few days passed in a haze of simplicity. Emily woke with the sun, made coffee in the small kitchen, and spent her mornings walking through the vineyards. The rhythm was soothing, predictable. She liked predictable. She explored the property, discovering a small herb garden behind the villa, overgrown but still fragrant with rosemary and thyme. She found a stone bench under an olive tree, its surface worn smooth by time. She sat there for hours, reading books she'd bought at the Florence airport, letting the Italian words on the covers remain a mystery. In the afternoons, she drove to the local village, a cluster of stone buildings with a market, a bakery, and a small church. The vendors smiled at her attempts at Italian, correcting her gently, rewarding her efforts with extra fruit or fresh bread. Emily started to feel like she could breathe again. But on the fourth day, everything changed. She was carrying groceries up the stone path when she noticed movement next door. The neighboring villa, which had been empty since she arrived, now showed signs of life. A sleek black car sat in the driveway, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight like something out of a movie. And then she saw him. He stood near the entrance, speaking on the phone in rapid Italian. His voice was low, commanding, the kind that expected to be obeyed. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his white dress shirt perfectly. His dark hair was slightly tousled, like he'd run his hands through it moments before, and even from a distance Emily could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the aristocratic slope of his nose. He wore dark trousers that fit him like they'd been tailored specifically for his frame. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing tanned forearms and a watch that caught the light. Expensive, understated. There was an effortless elegance to him, the kind that came from wealth and confidence and never having to prove either. Emily's pulse quickened. She told herself to look away, to focus on her groceries, to not care who her neighbor was. This was exactly what she didn't need. Distractions, complications. But then he turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. His gaze was intense, piercing, the kind that made her feel exposed, like he could see past the walls she'd spent months building, past the polite smiles and the "I'm fine," and the careful distance she kept from everyone. His eyes were dark, almost black in the sunlight, and they held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He smiled, slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly what effect he was having on her. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, and then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back to his phone call and disappeared inside the villa. Emily stood frozen on the path, her groceries forgotten in her arms. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her skin flushed despite the mild temperature. What was that? She shook her head, forcing herself to move. She hurried inside, setting the groceries on the kitchen counter with trembling hands. It was nothing. A glance, a smile. People smiled at each other all the time, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That the safe, predictable world she'd built over the past few days had just cracked open. That evening, Emily tried to distract herself. She made a simple pasta with tomatoes and basil from the market. She poured a glass of wine, the cheap kind the vendor had recommended with a knowing wink. She sat on her terrace as the sun set, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. But her eyes kept drifting to the villa next door. The lights were on. She could see movement through the windows. At one point she thought she heard music, something classical, elegant. Emily forced herself to look away. She was being ridiculous. She'd come here to escape, to heal, not to develop a crush on some stranger based on a smile. But God, what a smile. She was finishing her wine when she heard footsteps on gravel. "Buonasera." The voice came from the low stone wall separating their properties. Emily looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. He stood there, one hand casually resting on the ledge, backlit by the lights from his villa. Up close he was even more striking. His features were sharp, sculpted, like something out of a Renaissance painting. His eyes, those impossibly dark eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. But it was the way he looked at her that made her pulse race, like she was the only thing in the world worth his attention. "I'm Federico," he said, his accent smooth, cultured, his English flawless. "Your neighbor." Emily set her wine down, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Hair pulled into a messy bun, no makeup, an old Columbia University t-shirt and jeans. "Emily," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled, and it was devastating, the kind of smile that probably made women forget their own names. "American," he said. Not a question. "Is it that obvious?" "Your wine," he said, nodding toward the bottle on the table. Emily glanced down at the simple bottle she'd bought at the market, feeling her cheeks flush. Federico chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone." There was a playful edge to his tone, but beneath it something darker, something she couldn't quite name, like he was used to keeping secrets. "What brings you to Tuscany?" he asked, his gaze never leaving hers. Emily hesitated. She didn't owe him an explanation. They were strangers. She could make something up, a vacation, a work trip, anything, but there was something disarming about the way he waited. Patient, like he had all the time in the world and nowhere more important to be. "I needed a change," she said finally. "Running from something?" Her breath caught. "What makes you say that?" He tilted his head, studying her with those dark, knowing eyes. "You have the look." "What look?" "Someone who's trying very hard to disappear." Emily's heart pounded. The accuracy of his observation felt like being seen naked. How could he possibly know that? "And you?" she asked, deflecting, desperate to shift the focus away from herself. "What brings you here?" Federico's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Business." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "What kind of business?" Emily asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "The kind that requires privacy," he said smoothly. There was a warning in his tone, subtle but clear. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. Emily should have felt uneasy, should have made an excuse and gone inside, should have recognized the red flags waving in front of her face. But instead she found herself leaning forward, drawn to the mystery he carried like a second skin. "Well," she said, raising her glass, "to privacy." Federico's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise? Amusement? Respect? "To privacy," he echoed, his voice like velvet. He held her gaze for another heartbeat, and Emily felt the air between them crackle with something electric. And then he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows of his villa as silently as he'd appeared. Emily sat there alone, her wine forgotten, her mind racing. She didn't know who Federico Santini was. But she had a feeling she was about to find out, and God help her, she wanted to. The following morning, Emily woke to the sound of voices, sharp, tense, speaking in rapid Italian. She threw on a robe and stepped onto the terrace, squinting against the bright morning sunlight. Next door, Federico stood in his driveway speaking with two men. They wore dark suits despite the heat, their postures rigid, their expressions carved from stone. One of them handed Federico a folder, and he flipped through it quickly, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense. Emily couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension was palpable even from a distance. The air seemed to vibrate with it. Federico's voice rose, sharp and commanding. One of the men responded with equal force. They weren't shouting, but the controlled anger in their exchange was somehow more frightening than screaming would have been. One of the men glanced up and caught her watching. His eyes narrowed, cold and assessing. Emily's pulse spiked. She should go inside, pretend she hadn't seen anything, but she stood frozen, unable to look away. Federico followed the man's gaze, and when he saw Emily, his expression shifted. The hardness melted away like ice under sunlight, replaced by something softer. Concern. He said something to the men in Italian, his tone leaving no room for argument, dismissing them. The men exchanged glances but didn't argue. They got into their car, another sleek black vehicle, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Then Federico looked up at her and smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Emily." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Morning," she called back, trying to sound casual, trying to pretend she hadn't just witnessed something that felt dangerous. Federico tilted his head, studying her. "Join me for coffee?" Every instinct Emily had developed over 32 years of life told her to say no, to keep her distance, to not get involved with whatever complicated, possibly dangerous situation she'd just glimpsed. But something stronger pulled her forward. "Give me 10 minutes, she heard herself say. She found him waiting on his terrace 10 minutes later, having changed into a simple sundress and run a brush through her hair. A small table had been set with espresso cups, pastries that looked like they'd come from a professional bakery, and fresh fruit arranged on a ceramic platter. The view from his terrace was even more stunning than hers. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, bathed in golden morning light that made everything look like a painting. "You didn't have to do this," Emily said, sitting down across from him. "I wanted to," Federico said simply, pouring rich, dark espresso into delicate cups. He moved with precision, elegance, every gesture deliberate and controlled. Emily watched his hands, strong, capable, with long fingers and a faint scar running across his knuckles. She wondered how he'd gotten it, but didn't ask. "How are you finding Tuscany?" he asked, sliding a cup toward her. "Quiet," Emily said, wrapping her hands around the warm porcelain. "Peaceful. Is that what you need?" Peace? There it was again, that ability to see straight through her, to ask the questions that mattered. Emily took a sip of the espresso. It was perfect, strong, smooth, nothing like the bitter coffee she'd been making in the villa's small kitchen. "I think so," she said carefully. Federico leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. The morning sun caught the angles of his face, making him look even more striking. "You don't sound convinced." "I don't know what I need anymore," Emily admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. She'd barely admitted that to herself, let alone to a virtual stranger, but somehow Federico didn't feel like a stranger. "Maybe that's the point," Federico said softly, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "To stop knowing. To just Feel. His gaze held hers, and Emily felt her breath hitch. There was an intimacy in the way he spoke, in the space between his words, like they'd known each other for years instead of days. "What about you?" she asked, breaking the spell before she fell too deep into it. "What do you need?" Federico's smile was slow, dangerous, the kind that promised secrets and complications. "That's a complicated question. Try me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with something Emily couldn't name but could definitely feel. "I need," he said, his voice dropping to something almost confessional, "to forget." "Forget what?" "Everything." The single word carried weight, darkness, years of burden. Emily wanted to ask more, to pull back the layers and understand what had put that haunted look in his eyes. But something in his expression stopped her, a vulnerability that felt sacred, private. Instead, she took another sip of her espresso, letting the silence settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Do you always interrogate your neighbors?" Federico asked, a hint of amusement returning to his tone. "Only the mysterious ones." He laughed, and the sound was rich, genuine, transforming his face completely. "You think I'm mysterious? I think you're hiding something." Federico's smile faded, and for a moment Emily saw something raw in his eyes, real vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. "Everyone hides something, Emily," he said quietly. "So the question is whether what they're hiding is worth finding." She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if he was warning her away or inviting her closer, so she didn't say anything. They sat in silence, the morning sun warming their skin, the world around them still and perfect. Emily could hear birds singing in the olive trees, could smell jasmine on the breeze, could feel Federico's gaze on her like a physical touch. And for the first time since arriving in Tuscany, Emily didn't feel alone, which was terrifying, because she'd come here specifically to be alone, to heal, to figure out who she was without David, without the marriage, without all the plans that had crumbled to dust. But sitting across from Federico, watching the sunlight play across his features, Emily wondered if maybe loneliness wasn't what she needed after all. They spent the rest of the morning together. Federico showed her around his property, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, a pool that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and rows of grapevines that he explained were being cultivated for a private wine label. "You make wine?" Emily asked, running her fingers over the leaves of a vine. "My family has for generations," Federico said, "though I'll admit I'm better at drinking it than making it." Emily laughed, and Federico's eyes softened at the sound. They walked through the gardens, Federico pointing out different flowers and herbs, sharing stories about his grandmother who'd planted most of them. His voice carried a tenderness when he spoke of her that made Emily's chest ache. "She sounds wonderful," Emily said. "She was," Federico agreed. "She was the only person who ever made this place feel like home. And now?" Federico stopped walking, turning to face her. "Now it feels like a cage." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Before Emily could respond, his phone rang. Federico glanced at the screen, and his expression shuttered immediately. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice suddenly formal. "I have to take this." "Of course." He answered the phone in Italian, walking away toward the house, but Emily could hear the tension in his voice, see it in the rigid set of his shoulders. She stood alone in the garden, surrounded by beauty, feeling like she'd just glimpsed something she wasn't supposed to see. That evening, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Federico, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, the weight of the things left unsaid. She tried to distract herself with a book, but the words blurred together. The characters felt flat compared to the very real, very complicated man next door. Finally, she gave up and poured herself a glass of wine. A better bottle this time, one she'd splurged on at the market, and stepped out onto the terrace. The night was warm, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle. Below, the vineyard stretched into darkness, and above the stars burned bright in a sky unpolluted by city lights. Emily had never seen so many stars. Couldn't sleep either. She jumped, nearly spilling her wine. Federico stood at the edge of his terrace, leaning against the railing. He wore a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, and in the moonlight his features looked even more striking. More real, somehow. Less polished. "You scared me," Emily said, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with being startled. "Sorry," he said, though the slight smirk on his face suggested he wasn't sorry at all. He climbed over the low stone wall separating their terraces with effortless grace, moving with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his body. And then he walked toward her. Emily's pulse quickened with every step he took. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though she made no move to stop him, made no move to go inside or create distance. "Probably not," Federico agreed, stopping just a few feet away. The space between them hummed with tension, the kind that made Emily's skin feel too tight, her breath too shallow. "Why are you really here, Federico?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In Tuscany." His jaw tightened. She watched a muscle jump beneath the stubble on his cheek. "I told you. Business. What kind of business requires this much secrecy? Those men this morning were nothing you need to worry about." "But, Emily," her name was a warning, gentle but firm. "Some questions are better left unasked." "Why?" Federico stepped closer, and suddenly he was right there, close enough that Emily could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Because," he said softly, "once you know, you can't unknow. And I don't want that for you. What if I want to know anyway? You don't. How do you know what I want?" Federico's eyes searched hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. "My family," he said finally, his voice rough, each word pulled from somewhere deep, "is involved in things most people would call illegal." Emily's breath caught. She'd suspected, of course. The expensive car, the tense meetings, the way Federico carried himself like someone used to danger, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. "The Mafia," she said. It wasn't a question. Federico didn't deny it. He just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to run, expecting her to run. His whole body was tense, coiled, like he was bracing for impact. But Emily didn't move. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. She should be. She knew that. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to go inside, lock the door, maybe even pack her things and leave Tuscany entirely. But when she looked into his eyes, all she saw was a man carrying the weight of a world he didn't choose, a man who'd just trusted her with the truth when he could have kept lying. "No," she whispered. Federico's eyes widened just slightly, like he hadn't expected that answer, like maybe no one had ever given him that answer before. "You should be," he said. "Maybe," Emily said, "but I'm not." They stood there, the night wrapping around them like a cocoon, the air thick with jasmine and possibility, and something neither of them could name. And then Federico reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but it sent fire through her veins. "You're dangerous, Emily Carter," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "So are you." His lips curved into a slow, devastating smile. "Yes," he said, "I am." And Emily knew in that moment, standing under the Tuscan stars, with a man who'd just admitted to being part of the Mafia, that she was already falling, already lost, and she didn't care. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and unspoken promises. Morning coffee on Federico's terrace became routine. Evening walks through the vineyards, their shoulders brushing, became essential. Conversations that stretched long into the night, stars bearing witness to confessions neither had planned to make. Emily told herself it was just friendship, that she was reading too much into the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and fragile. The way his hand would linger on the small of her back when they walked, his touch burning through the thin fabric of her sundress, the way his voice softened when he said her name, like it was a prayer or a secret. But deep down, she knew better. This was dangerous territory, and she was walking straight into it with her eyes wide open. One afternoon, Federico took her to a small village nestled deeper in the hills. They drove with the windows down, warm air whipping through the car, Italian radio playing softly. Federico sang along to a song Emily didn't recognize, his voice surprisingly good, and she found herself smiling. "What?" he asked, catching her expression. Nothing, you just seem different today. Different how? Lighter, Emily said. Like you're not carrying the weight of the world. Federico's smile faded slightly. Maybe that's because of you. The admission hung between them. Too honest, too raw. Emily looked away, her heart pounding. They wandered through cobblestone streets barely wide enough for a car to pass, past flower-covered balconies where laundry hung drying in the sun, past ancient churches with doors worn smooth by centuries of hands. Old women sat in doorways, watching them with knowing eyes. Children played football in a tiny piazza, their laughter echoing off stone walls. "This is where my grandmother was from," Federico said as they stopped in the center of the piazza. He pointed to a building with faded blue shutters. She lived there until she was 18. Emily looked around, taking in the simple beauty of the place. Time moved differently here. Slower. Like the modern world hadn't quite reached this corner of Tuscany. "It's lovely," she said. "She used to tell me stories about growing up here," Federico continued, his voice carrying a note of longing. "About how the world was simpler, kinder, how people looked out for each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to." There was a sadness in his voice, a yearning for something lost and irretrievable. "Do you wish you could go back?" Emily asked. "To a simpler time?" Federico turned to her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Every day. The honesty in his words took her breath away. An old man called out to Federico from across the piazza, waving. Federico responded in rapid Italian, his whole demeanor shifting, warmer, more open. The man approached, embracing Federico like a son, kissing both his cheeks. They spoke for several minutes while Emily stood to the side, not understanding the words but reading the affection in their body language. The old man kept glancing at her with curiosity and approval, saying something that made Federico laugh and shake his head. When they parted, Federico took Emily's hand, the first time he'd done so deliberately, and led her down a narrow alley. "What did he say?" Emily asked, acutely aware of his fingers intertwined with hers. "He said my grandmother would have liked you." Emily's throat tightened. How would he know? "Because," Federico said, squeezing her hand gently, "she always said I needed someone who wasn't afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you." "I know," Federico said softly. "That's what terrifies me." They stopped at a small cafe tucked into a corner of the village, sitting outside under a canopy of grapevines. The owner, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and flour on her apron, greeted Federico with the same warmth the old man had shown. Federico ordered for them in Italian, his voice smooth and confident. Emily watched him, marveling at the contradiction he presented. Dangerous, but gentle. Powerful, but tender. A man who moved between worlds with practiced ease. When the food arrived, Emily realized she was starving. They ate in comfortable silence, fresh pasta with wild boar ragu, bread still warm from the oven, a simple salad dressed with olive oil that tasted like liquid gold. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said finally, setting down her fork. "Always. Why did you tell me about your family?" Federico set down his own fork, his expression growing serious. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the worn wooden table. "Because you deserve the truth," he said finally. "But we barely know each other. Don't we?" he asked, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. Emily's heart pounded. He was right. Despite the short time they'd known each other, it felt like something deeper, something that transcended logic and time and reason. "I feel like I've known you my whole life," Federico said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Like I've been waiting for you without knowing I was waiting." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes burning with unexpected tears. "I feel it too." The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable and terrifying. Federico reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, grounding, real. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then don't." His thumb traced slow circles on her skin, sending shivers up her arm, despite the warm afternoon. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because my world is dangerous, Emily." "And you—" He paused, his eyes searching hers with something that looked like desperation. "You're too good for it. Too pure." Emily pulled her hand back, frustration flaring hot in her chest. "Don't decide what's good for me. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection, Emily said, her voice sharp. I need honesty. I need you to stop treating me like I'm fragile. Federico's jaw tightened. You don't understand what you're asking. Then help me understand. They stared at each other across the table, the tension crackling between them like electricity. The cafe owner glanced over with concern, but neither of them noticed. Finally, Federico stood, pulling bills from his wallet and throwing them on the table. Let's go. Emily followed him back to the car, her emotions a tangled mess of anger and longing and confusion. They drove in silence, the countryside blurring past, the earlier lightness replaced by something heavy and suffocating. When they arrived back at the villas, Federico walked her to her door. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Emily, he said, his voice low. She turned, her heart in her throat. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive. His hand came up, cupping her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. I'm trying, he whispered, his forehead nearly touching hers. I'm trying so hard to stay away. Then stop trying, Emily breathed, her hands finding his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms. Federico's eyes darkened, pupils dilating, and for a moment she thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to, needed him to. But instead he stepped back, his hand dropping, leaving her cold despite the warm evening. Good night, Emily. And then he was gone, walking back to his villa with measured steps, his shoulders tense. Emily stood there on her doorstep, her heart pounding, her body trembling with want and frustration. She was in too deep and she didn't care. 2 days passed without a word from Federico. Emily told herself she didn't care, that it was better this way, that the distance would help her remember why she'd come to Tuscany in the first place, to heal, to find herself, not to fall for a man who'd openly admitted to being part of the Mafia, but the ache in her chest said otherwise. Every time she heard a sound next door, her pulse would spike. Every time she looked out her window and saw his empty terrace, disappointment would wash over her. She threw herself into exploring the area, driving to different villages and towns. She visited the Siena Cathedral, standing in awe of its intricate marble floors and soaring architecture. She wandered through Florence's Uffizi Gallery, losing herself in Renaissance art. She sat in cafes, writing in the journal she'd bought, trying to process everything she was feeling. But everything reminded her of him. The espresso she ordered tasted bland compared to the coffee he'd made. The sunsets seemed less vibrant without someone to share them with. The silence of her villa felt oppressive instead of peaceful. On the third day, she heard a car pull up next door. Her heart leaped, but when she looked out, it wasn't Federico's sleek black vehicle. It was the 2 men from before, and they didn't look happy. Emily watched from her window as they pounded on Federico's door, their body language aggressive. When he finally answered, there was a heated exchange in Italian. Even without understanding the words, Emily could read the anger, the threats. One of the men shoved Federico hard enough that he stumbled back a step. Federico shoved back harder. Emily's pulse spiked, adrenaline flooding her system. The argument escalated, voices rising. One of the men gestured wildly. Federico stood his ground, his posture defensive but firm. And then she saw it. A gun. One of the men pulled it from inside his jacket, pointing it directly at Federico's chest. Emily's blood ran cold. She didn't think. Didn't consider the consequences, didn't remember that she was supposed to be staying out of dangerous situations. She grabbed her phone and ran outside. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the property. All 3 men turned to her, shock registering on their faces. Federico's expression shifted from anger to pure terror. "Emily, go inside." But she didn't move, couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. The man with the gun lowered it slightly, confusion flickering across his hard features. He said something to Federico in Italian, his tone questioning. Federico responded sharply, stepping between Emily and the men, his body a shield. His voice was commanding, authoritative, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. There was a tense moment where nobody moved, nobody breathed. Emily could see the calculation in the men's eyes, could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. And then, slowly, the man with the gun put it away. He said something else to Federico, a warning maybe, or a threat, and then both men got in their car and drove away, tires spitting gravel. The silence they left behind was deafening. Federico turned to Emily, his face pale with fury. "What the hell were you thinking?" "They had a gun." "Exactly. You could have been hurt." His voice was raw, edged with fear she'd never heard before. "So could you. That's different." "How?" Emily demanded, stepping closer. "How is that different?" Federico ran both hands through his hair, his chest heaving. "Because I'm used to it. Because this is my life, Emily. This is what I was trying to protect you from." "I don't need protection." "Yes, you do," Federico shouted, and Emily had never heard him raise his voice before. "You have no idea what these people are capable of, what they would do to you if they thought you mattered to me." The words hung in the air between them. "If you mattered to me," Emily's breath caught. "Do I? Do you what?" "Matter to you." Federico stared at her, his expression cracking, all the careful control he maintained crumbling. "Yes," he said, the word torn from somewhere deep. "God help me, yes." Emily closed the distance between them. "Then don't push me away. Not now. Not because you're scared." "Emily." Her name was a plea. "I'm already in this, Federico. Don't you see? I'm already in this, whether you push me away or not." He stared at her, something breaking in his expression. All the walls he'd built, all the distance he'd tried to maintain. It shattered, and then he pulled her into his arms. Emily buried her face in his chest, feeling his heart pound against hers like a war drum. His arms wrapped around her, tight, almost crushing, like he was afraid she might disappear. "You're impossible," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough. "So are you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His eyes searched hers, dark and intense, and filled with something that made her dizzy. "I can't keep you safe," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't care." "You should." "Federico," Emily whispered, her hands gripping his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric. "I'm already in this. Don't you understand? The moment you told me the truth, the moment I chose to stay, I made my choice." His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for fear, for any reason to let her go. But Emily held his gaze steady. "This is a mistake," he whispered, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I don't care," Emily said again. And then, finally, he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was afraid she might break. His lips brushed against hers softly, questioning. But Emily leaned in, her hands sliding up to his neck, and something shifted. The kiss deepened, urgent, desperate, like they were both drowning and the other was air. Federico's hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. Emily pressed closer, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers, feeling his heartbeat hammering in time with her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Federico rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he whispered. "I know. There's no going back. I don't want to go back." Federico pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes burning with intensity. "Then we do this together." "Together," Emily agreed, and this time, when he kissed her, it felt like a promise. That night, Federico told her everything. They sat on his terrace, the stars brilliant above them, a bottle of wine between them that neither touched. And he laid bare the life he'd been born into, like opening a wound. Emily listened, her hand in his, her heart breaking for the boy who'd never had a choice. "My grandfather started the business," Federico said, his voice quiet but steady. "Wine, olive oil, legitimate things. But there was another side. Protection, favors, things that required leverage." He paused, his jaw tightening. "By the time my father took over, the legitimate business was just a front. The real money came from construction contracts, political connections, controlling territory. I grew up watching men kiss my father's hand, watching people fear him." "What about your mother?" Emily asked softly. Federico's expression softened. "She tried to shield me from it. Sent me to boarding school in Switzerland, then university in England. She wanted me to have a different life, but my father..." He shook his head. "My father saw me as his heir, his legacy. You didn't want it." "No," Federico said simply. "I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to design buildings, create something beautiful, something that didn't involve fear or blood or impossible choices. Emily squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, like she was anchoring him. When I turned 25, my father had a stroke. Massive. The doctors said he'd never recover fully. The family needed someone to take over. My uncle tried, but he didn't have the respect, the authority, so they came to me. And you couldn't say no. I could have, Federico said, his voice bitter. I should have, but my mother begged me, said the family would tear itself apart without leadership, said my father's enemies would come for us if we showed weakness. She was right. He fell silent, his eyes distant. I told myself it would be temporary, that I'd stabilize things and then leave. That was 8 years ago. Why haven't you left? Because every time I try, something happens. A rival family makes a move. A politician needs handling. Someone needs to be reminded why crossing the Santinis is a bad idea. His voice was hollow. I've tried to leave 3 times. Each time they pulled me back. Emily's chest ached. What happens if you just walk away? Federico laughed, but there was no humor in it. They'll come after me, after anyone I care about. My mother, my younger sister who lives in Milan and thinks I run a wine business. Anyone who matters to me becomes a target. The implication hung heavy between them. That's why you pushed me away, Emily said. Yes, but you're telling me now anyway. Federico turned to her, his eyes intense. Because you deserve the truth. Because pretending this isn't happening, pretending I don't feel what I feel, it's not protecting you, it's just lying to both of us. What do you feel? The question hung between them, vulnerable and necessary. Federico's hand came up, cupping her face with a tenderness that made tears prick Emily's eyes. I feel like I've been half alive for 8 years, he said quietly, going through the motions, playing a role, and then you showed up at this villa, running from your own ghosts, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to want something, to hope for something. Emily's breath caught. I'm falling for you, Emily Carter, Federico whispered. God help us both, but I'm falling for you. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. I'm falling for you too. Federico pulled her close, and they sat there wrapped in each other as the night stretched around them. Emily could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, could feel his breath in her hair. What do we do? She whispered. I don't know, Federico admitted. But I know I don't want to lose you. Then don't, Emily said, echoing her earlier words. Federico pulled back to look at her, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. It won't be easy. There will be people who don't approve. Situations that are dangerous. You'll have to trust me even when I can't explain everything. I can do that. You'll have to accept that parts of my life are dark, that I've done things I'm not proud of. I can accept that. Emily. Her name was a warning and a plea. She took his face in her hands, making him look at her. I'm not naive, Federico. I know what I'm choosing, and I'm choosing you anyway. Something broke in his expression. Relief and hope and fear all tangled together, and then he kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. They stayed on the terrace until the stars began to fade, talking in whispers, sharing pieces of themselves they'd hidden from the world. Emily told him about David, about the betrayal, the divorce, the feeling of being discarded like she'd never mattered, about coming to Tuscany to disappear. I'm glad you came here, Federico said, pressing a kiss to her temple. So am I. Even knowing what you know now? Especially knowing what I know now. Federico smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, lighter. Stay with me tonight, he said. Just stay. I'll take the couch. I just want you close. Emily's heart swelled. Okay. They went inside, and Federico gave her one of his shirts to sleep in. It was soft, worn, and smelled like him. Emily changed in his bathroom, catching her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes looked brighter, her cheeks flushed. She looked alive in a way she hadn't in months. When she came out, Federico had made up the couch for himself with blankets and a pillow. He'd changed into sleep pants and a t-shirt, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. The bed's through there, he said, gesturing to a door. But Emily walked to him instead. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining. Stay with me, she said. I don't want to be alone. Federico's eyes darkened. Emily, just to sleep. I need to feel you close. He nodded, and they went to his bedroom together. The bed was massive, covered in white linens that looked impossibly soft. They lay down facing each other, inches apart in the darkness. "Thank you," Emily whispered, "for trusting me with the truth." "Thank you for not running," Federico whispered back. He reached out, his hand finding hers between them, and they fell asleep like that, fingers intertwined, hearts slowly learning to beat in sync. Emily woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the warm weight of an arm draped over her waist. For a moment she froze, disoriented. Then memory flooded back. Federico's terrace, his confession, falling asleep in his bed. She turned carefully, not wanting to wake him. He lay beside her, his face relaxed in sleep, dark lashes resting against his cheeks. He looked younger like this, peaceful. The lines of tension that usually bracketed his mouth had smoothed away. Emily's heart clenched. This beautiful, complicated man had let her in, had shown her his scars and his darkness, and trusted her not to run. As if sensing her gaze, Federico's eyes opened. For a moment, he looked confused. Then he smiled, slow and devastating. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months." Federico's smile widened. His hand came up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with infinite gentleness. "Coffee?" he asked. "Coffee sounds perfect." They got up, and Federico made espresso while Emily sat at his kitchen island, watching him move around the space with easy familiarity. He'd put on reading glasses to measure out the coffee, and Emily found it ridiculously endearing. "What?" he asked, catching her staring. "Nothing. You just look domestic." Federico laughed. "Don't let that get around. It would ruin my reputation." They took their coffee out to the terrace, where the morning sun was already warming the stone. Emily breathed in the Tuscan air, feeling more content than she had in years. "I could get used to this," she said without thinking. Federico looked at her, his expression unreadable. "So could I." They spent the morning together, easy and comfortable. Federico showed her how to make proper Italian pasta from scratch, flour dusting their hands, their shoulders brushing as they worked side by side. "You're a natural," he said, watching her roll out the dough. "Liar. This looks terrible." "It looks perfect." "You're biased." "Completely," he agreed, dropping a kiss on her shoulder that made her heart stutter. They cooked the pasta for lunch, eating on the terrace with a simple sauce Federico whipped up from tomatoes and herbs from his garden. It was the best meal Emily had ever eaten, though she suspected that had more to do with the company than the food. But as the afternoon wore on, Federico grew quiet, distracted. He kept checking his phone, his expression darkening with each message. "What's wrong?" Emily asked finally. Federico set down his phone, running a hand through his hair. "I have to go to Florence tomorrow, family business. How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3. He looked at her, his eyes troubled. "I don't want to leave you. I'll be fine." "Emily, after what happened yesterday, those men won't come back. You made that clear. I made it clear you're under my protection, which means they'll report it to my uncle, which means—" He trailed off, jaw tightening. "Which means what?" Federico sighed. "Which means I'll have to explain who you are, why you matter." Emily's pulse quickened. "And what will you tell them?" He looked at her for a long moment. "The truth. That you're mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have bothered her, should have triggered all her post-divorce wariness about being claimed, owned, treated like property. But coming from Federico, it felt different. It felt like protection, like promise. "I'm yours," Emily said softly, testing the words. Federico's eyes darkened. He stood, crossing to her chair and pulling her up to stand before him. "Say it again," he commanded gently. "I'm yours." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and Emily melted into it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Federico rested his forehead against hers. "I have to go to this meeting," he said, "but I'll come back, I promise." "I believe you." The next morning, Emily woke alone in her own bed. She'd gone back to her villa the night before, needing space to think, to process everything that was happening. She watched from her terrace as Federico loaded a bag into his car. He wore a dark suit that made him look every inch the powerful man he was, intimidating, untouchable. But when he looked up and saw her, he smiled, waved, and Emily saw the man beneath the armor. He drove away, and the villas fell silent. Emily tried to keep busy. She went to the market, practiced her Italian with the vendors, bought fresh flowers for her table. She read on the terrace, took a long walk through the vineyards, but everything felt hollow without Federico. She was in trouble. Deep, dangerous trouble. She'd come to Tuscany to heal from one man, and somehow she'd fallen for another. A man infinitely more complicated. A man whose life involved guns and threats and impossible choices. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. That evening, as Emily was making dinner, her phone rang. An unknown number with an Italian area code. She answered hesitantly. "Hello? Miss Carter?" A woman's voice, accented but clear. "Yes? My name is Lucia Santini. I'm Federico's mother." Emily's breath caught. "Oh, hello. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Federico gave me your number. He thought we should speak." "Of course," Emily said, her mind racing. "Is everything okay?" "That depends," Lucia said, and there was steel beneath the politeness. "On what your intentions are with my son." Emily sat down, her legs suddenly weak. "I'm not sure I understand. Federico told the family about you, about an American woman staying next door who has captured his attention. This has caused some concern." "Concern? My son's life is complicated, Miss Carter. I'm sure he's explained this to you." "He has." "Then you understand that the people he associates with, the world he moves in, it's not safe for outsiders, particularly not for someone he cares about." Emily's chest tightened. "Are you asking me to leave?" There was a pause. Then, surprisingly, Lucia laughed softly. "No, Cara, I'm asking if you're prepared to stay. There's a difference." I don't know what you mean." "Federico has carried the weight of this family for 8 years, Lucia said, her voice gentling. 8 years of sacrifice, of putting duty before everything else, and in all that time I have never heard him sound the way he sounded when he spoke about you." Emily's throat tightened with emotion. "Hope," Lucia continued. "He sounded like he had hope again. So no, I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking if you're strong enough to stay, because loving my son, truly loving him, will require strength, patience, the ability to live with uncertainty and fear." "I know," Emily whispered. "Do you? Because once you're part of his life, truly part of it, there's no going back. The family will know about you. His enemies will know about you. You'll become a target, a liability, something to be protected or exploited." Emily took a shaky breath. "I understand. And you're still here?" "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Good. Because I think my son needs you, Miss Carter. More than he's needed anyone in a very long time." Tears pricked Emily's eyes. "He told me about you. About how you tried to give him a different life." "I failed," Lucia said sadly. "No. You gave him a choice. Even if he chose to come back, even if duty pulled him back, you gave him the knowledge that another life was possible. That matters." Lucia was quiet for a long moment. "Perhaps you're right. Will you come to dinner when Federico returns? I'd like to meet the woman who's given my son hope." "I'd be honored." "Ben, take care of yourself, Cara, and don't wander far from the villa." Federico left guards watching the property, though you won't see them. The words should have been alarming. Instead, they were oddly comforting. "Thank you for calling, Mrs. Santini. Lucia, please, and Emily, welcome to the family." The line went dead. Emily sat there in her kitchen, phone still in hand, heart pounding. Welcome to the family. She'd come to Tuscany to escape one life, and somehow she'd stumbled into another. Federico returned late on the 3rd day. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest, when she heard the sound of his car on the gravel drive. She was out the door before she could think, running across the property in bare feet, her heart hammering. Federico was climbing out of the car, his suit rumpled, exhaustion written in every line of his body. But when he saw her running toward him, his face transformed. He caught her as she launched herself into his arms, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her hair. "I missed you," he murmured. "I missed you too." He set her down, his hands framing her face, and kissed her like he'd been starving for it. Emily kissed him back with equal desperation, her fingers tangling in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Federico rested his forehead against hers. "My mother called you," he said. "Not a question." "She did." I hope she didn't scare you. She didn't. She was kind, protective. Federico smiled. She likes you. She told me so. Said you had strength. She invited me to dinner. She did? Federico pulled back to look at her, surprise in his eyes. Is that bad? No, it's good. It means she approves, which is important because... He trailed off, suddenly looking nervous. Because what? Federico took her hand, leading her to the stone wall where they'd first talked. They sat together under the stars, and Emily waited, sensing he needed time to find the words. The family knows about you now, he said finally. My uncle, my cousins, the associates. They know there's an American woman I'm involved with. And they're not happy about it. They see you as a weakness, a distraction, something that could compromise my judgment. Emily's chest tightened. What did you tell them? Federico turned to her, his eyes fierce. I told them they were right. That you do affect my judgment. That for the first time in 8 years I'm making decisions based on what I want, not just what the family needs. And that if they have a problem with that, they can find someone else to clean up their messes. Emily's breath caught. Federico, I'm done, Emily. I'm done pretending this life is something I want. I'm done sacrificing everything for a legacy I never asked for. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm leaving. I'm walking away from the family business, from all of it. Emily's heart raced. Can you do that? Just walk away? Not easily. There will be negotiations, conditions. I'll have to set things up so the transition is smooth, so my uncle can take over without causing a power vacuum. It might take months. And then? Federico took her hands, his grip firm and certain. And then I'm free. We're free. We? Emily. He slid off the wall, kneeling in front of her, and her breath stopped entirely. I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Tears began streaming down Emily's face. Come with me, Federico said. When I leave this life, come with me. We'll go anywhere you want. Build a life that's ours, not dictated by duty or fear or the past. I'll design buildings. You'll... whatever you want to do. Write. Paint. Absolutely nothing, if that's what makes you happy. Federico, I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. I know you've been hurt and I know trust takes time. I'm just asking you to choose this. Choose us. Choose the possibility of something real. Emily slid off the wall and into his arms, pressing her face against his shoulder as she sobbed. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of finally finding something that felt right. Yes, she whispered. Yes. Federico pulled back to look at her, hope blazing in his eyes. Yes. Yes. I choose you. I choose us. He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it, relief and love and promise. When they broke apart, both laughing through their tears, the future suddenly seemed impossibly bright. The next morning, Emily woke to find Federico already up, on the phone speaking rapid Italian, but his free hand was stroking her hair, keeping her close. When he hung up, he kissed her forehead. That was my lawyer. We're starting the process, drawing up papers, setting conditions for my exit. How long will it take? 6 months, maybe. Maybe less if I'm willing to make concessions. What kind of concessions? Federico's jaw tightened. Financial. Territorial. The family keeps certain assets, certain connections. I walk away with enough to live comfortably, but not enough to start a rival operation. And you're okay with that? Emily, I'd walk away with nothing if it meant being free of this. The money doesn't matter. You matter. She kissed him, soft and lingering. What do we do for 6 months? She asked. We stay here. I finish what needs to be finished and we plan our future. Where do you want to go after? Federico smiled. I was thinking maybe America, New York if you want to go back, or somewhere new, California, Oregon, anywhere you want. What about your architecture? You said you wanted to design buildings. His eyes lit up. I've been thinking about that. There's a firm in Portland that does sustainable design, green buildings. I reached out while I was in Florence. They're interested in meeting. Emily's heart swelled. You did that? I told you. I'm done living for other people. I want a life that's mine. Ours. The months that followed were the strangest, most beautiful period of Emily's life. She watched Federico systematically dismantle his involvement in the family business. There were tense meetings, shouting matches in Italian that she couldn't understand but could feel the weight of. There were late nights when he came home exhausted, collapsing into her arms. But there were also mornings waking up together, afternoons exploring Tuscany, visiting every village and vineyard they could find, evenings cooking dinner side by side, learning to move around each other with easy familiarity. Emily met Federico's mother over dinner at a beautiful villa in Florence. Lucia Santini was elegant, sharp-eyed, and fiercely protective of her son. But she embraced Emily warmly, whispering in her ear, "Thank you for giving him back to me." She met Federico's sister, Isabella, a brilliant lawyer in Milan who knew nothing about the family's true business. Isabella took Emily shopping, gossiped about Federico's childhood, treated her like family immediately. Emily called her parents in Boston, told them she wasn't coming home yet, that she'd found something, someone, worth staying for. Her mother was skeptical, her father was concerned, but they'd heard the happiness in her voice and reluctantly gave their blessing. And through it all, Emily and Federico grew closer, learning each other's rhythms, sharing dreams and fears, building something real and solid and true. 6 months to the day after Federico had first told her he was leaving, he walked into the villa they now shared, Emily having moved in 3 months prior, and simply said, "It's done." Emily looked up from her laptop where she'd been working on the novel she'd started writing. "Done? I'm out, officially. Papers signed, agreements in place. I'm a free man." Emily stood, her heart pounding. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "How do you feel?" Federico was quiet for a long moment, his arms tight around her. "Light," he said finally. "Like I can finally breathe." That evening, they sat on the terrace together, watching the Tuscan sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Where should we go first?" Emily asked. "Portland. I have that meeting with the architecture firm. After that?" He turned to her, his eyes soft. "After that, wherever you want." "What if I want to stay here?" Federico raised an eyebrow. "In Tuscany?" "Maybe. Or maybe we split time. 6 months here, 6 months somewhere else. Keep the villa as a home base." "You want to keep the villa? Don't you? This is where everything started, where we found each other." Federico smiled, pulling her close. "Then we keep the villa." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. "Emily?" Federico said softly. "Marry me." Emily pulled back to look at him, her heart stopping. "What?" Federico smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I said marry me. I know I said I wouldn't ask yet, but I can't wait anymore. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life together, whatever that looks like, wherever that takes us. So marry me, Emily Carter, please." He opened the box, revealing a simple, stunning ring, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds. "My grandmother's," he said. "My mother gave it to me, said she'd been saving it for the woman who saved me." Emily's vision blurred with tears. She looked at this beautiful, complicated man who'd chosen her, who'd walked away from everything he'd ever known for the chance at a real life, and she knew there was only one answer. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Federico slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her under the Tuscan stars, and Emily felt like she was finally home. 1 year later, Emily stood in the courtyard of the villa, wearing a simple white dress, wildflowers in her hair. Around her a small gathering of people she'd come to love, Federico's mother and sister, her own parents who'd flown from Boston, a handful of close friends from the village. And Federico, standing at the makeshift altar under the olive tree, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. They'd written their own vows, promised to choose each other every day, to build a life based on love and trust and the freedom to be themselves. When the officiant pronounced them married, Federico kissed her to cheers and applause. That night, at the reception under string lights in the garden, Emily's father pulled her aside. "Are you happy?" he asked. Emily looked across the courtyard at her husband. who was laughing at something Isabella had said, his face open and light. "More than I ever thought possible," she said. Her father smiled. "Good. That's all I've ever wanted for you." Later, when the guests had gone home and the stars were brilliant overhead, Federico and Emily stood on their terrace, the same terrace where they'd first really talked. "Do you ever regret it?" Emily asked. "Leaving your old life?" Federico pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not for a single second. You gave me something I never thought I'd have." "What's that?" "A future worth living." Emily turned in his arms, looking up at the man she loved. "You gave me the same thing." "Then we're even." "We're lucky." "We're blessed," Federico corrected. And standing there under the Tuscan stars, Emily had to agree. She'd come to Italy running from heartbreak. And she'd found home. The end. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, names, and situations are entirely fictional and created for storytelling and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to real events is purely coincidental. This narrative explores emotional journeys, personal choices, and romantic connections in a fictional context. It does not promote violence, illegal activity, or harmful behavior. Viewer discretion is advised for emotional intensity.